good and ill. And therefore, to be a person of piety, you have to be honourable and understand at all times your duty towards life. He was the god of the Gok Turks, described as the god of the Turks. And, you know, the Turks are interesting culturally in Central Asia, all the different parts of Turkish culture. And I have many Turkish friends. I've been to Turkey. I love it. And Tengri is their chief deity, if you want. There's inscriptions been found in the Orkhon script in what is now Mongolia, which has been written in ancient Turkish. But incredibly, they were using runes to write them down from Norse visiting runologists. So there's a lot of research into the early history of Tengri going on in religious studies. And of course in Kazakhstan and other parts of Central Asia, Tengri is still worshipped today by shamans. And if you're doing a shamanic ritual in Siberia or whatever, using the shamanic drum, which you've got here, they're bashing the shamanic drum to invoke Tengri, and then they're going back into the yurt to do the rituals. And so, you know, anthropologists have studied the shamanic tradition, and Mircea Eliade wrote about it, great Romanian French scholar, who ended up in Chicago. So Tengrists see Jesus as an incarnation of Tengri and argue that Tengri has had many sons throughout history. It's an honorific title for very special people who have very special duties to perform when in incarnation. So a son of God like Alexander the Great or Jesus or whoever is a son of Tengri. And that's why Jesus was always talking about my Father in heaven. So there are lots of people in Siberia doing Tengri worship to this day. I think personally it's you know, a fascinating religion, and as being studied by my colleagues in religious studies, it's thought in Mongolia at the moment that about 2.5% of the population worship Tengri. They've kept faithful to their ancient roots of shamanism. Genghis Khan also worshipped Tengri. There's a slight black mark against Tengri worship because Genghis Khan was a bit of a slaughterer, and he did begin the whole Mongolian Empire thing, which did mass slaughter a lot of people and cause a lot of trouble. And so if I'd have been at the court of Genghis Khan, I would have said, you know, Tengri doesn't really want you to go and mass slaughter everyone between China and, you know, Paris, because the Mongols tried to invade even France and Europe and caused tremendous suffering. And Russia and Ukraine. They sacked Kyiv. The whole Russia-Ukraine war is a sort of aftershock of the Mongolian invasion, actually, when Ukraine was utterly slaughtered and massacred by the Mongols. And that allowed Moscow to come up as a big power. Before then, Kyiv was the absolute centre of the Russian state. It was the place of spirituality. But after the chaos of the Mongols, Moscow stopped being a few villages and became a place you went to survive. And the Muscovites invented a good system, is they paid off the Mongols enough taxes to keep the armies from slaughtering them. And for about 100 years they kept paying the taxes, meanwhile stockpiling weapons and building a secret army. And eventually the ruler of Moscow felt strong enough to challenge the Mongols and defeated them in battle. And, you know, that's how Moscow got to be a great power. So it's all the chaos of Mongol invasions that caused this Kiev-Moscow thing. And I'm saying, like, come on guys, be friends, Moscow and Ukraine. Get over it. The Mongols are gone. You know, they're now just trying to worship Tengri and get on with their lives. And the Mongols became Buddhists as well. They accepted Shunyata, the Vajrayana Buddhist teachings, because there's a very similar thing going on in Tibetan Buddhism and Mongolian Buddhism. They worship the void, Shunyata, the source of everything. And that's very similar to Tengri. So Tengri is really the Shunyata at the heart of being, which is why we shouldn't take Maya seriously. It's all made of emptiness. Or as Einstein would say, it's made of the time-space, you know, bubble. So that's Tengri. We love him, don't we? Yes. And we can't survive without breathing. I mean, that's when Tengri comes into our lungs, to every breath. Now, so we've got the page of air, and now I would say about the air that it's being polluted by wrong thought, by miscommunications, by people lying. I mean, to be a true worshipper of Tengri, you have to tell the truth, because he can see everything. And he has a consort, by the way. There's a Mrs. Tengri, of course. And what Tengri doesn't want is war and the misuse of sky to do missile attacks and drones, all this stuff. Space should be demilitarized in the Tengri perspective. None of these things should be allowed. Planes, bombs, missiles, nuclear weapons. No, space is pristine, beautiful. And like the painting shows, crisp, beautiful mountain air, like in Switzerland. Let's keep it pristine, not misuse Tengri for war games. Okay, so now we move to the earth, which is the parallel element to the air, and we come back down to the earth, because we have the same thing. We have the page of earth now. Tengri is the page of air. The page of earth is Ea. Ea, a Babylonian god and Sumerian, who was the god of wisdom in Mesopotamia, known as Lord of the Earth. And some people argue it's the origin of, I mean, there's dispute among scholars of religion. Where does the word Yahweh come from in Hebrew? It could come from Yah, who might have pronounced his name Yah. And that became over time Yah, and then grew into Yahweh. It's possible, because the Hebrews certainly were passing through that region, and they spoke a dialect very similar to the Babylonians, Akkadian dialect. Interestingly, I've just discovered a new archaeological discovery has been made of a word list of a dialect of Semitic languages called Amorite and Akkadian, which is the language of Ea. And a scholar at the SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, where I used to study, has just, with some other colleagues, they've discovered that Hebrew is a dialect of Amorite, which this bilingual word list dates from about 2000 BC. So Hebrew is just Amorite, which is like a dialect that was spoken in Palestine and that part of the world. And the Babylonians knew about it because they were great scholars. And so they made an actual word list. And the Amorite is so similar to Hebrew that these scholars are now saying, my God, we've discovered the origin of Hebrew. It's Amorite. It was the language of the Canaanite population of Palestine at the time of the Babylonians, 2000 BC. So that's very interesting. So they might have adapted the word Ea to mean Yahweh, which was the name of one of their chief gods. He's the Lord of wisdom and knowledge. And initially he was called Enki in Sumerian. So the Sumerians called him Enki. And the Akkadians, who culturally began to dominate from Babylon, they called him Ea. En is the Sumerian for Lord. Ki is the earth, so the Lord of the earth. But he was called Ea, and it's he that rescues Noah from the flood, because there's going to be a flood, because all the gods are they're annoyed with mankind because we're being naughty, so they're going to send rain. And Ea whispers to the equivalent of Noah, who then rescues mankind. Utnapishtim is his name. He's the sage that can hear Ea's warning, and so builds an ark to save mankind, and all the animals as well. And it's exactly the story of Noah's flood. So, I mean, I've said this again and again, but biblical studies are really fascinating as a discipline, because we learn that the Bible is a compilation of legends, myths, stories, histories from a whole bunch of people over at least 1,000 years and more. And it includes the stories from the Sumerian and Babylonian people. And Noah, is a story that came from them into the Bible. And Abraham would have grown up with all this stuff. It was his mother's milk, learning the stories of, oh, tell me the one about Utnapishtim again, Dad. So, yes, the Lord of Wisdom. The Tower of Babel story is another one that is sourced in those days, because Ea is also Lord of Language. And a key text about Babel and Ea reads as follows. Once upon a time, there was no snake, there was no scorpion, there was no hyena, there was no lion, there was no wild dog, no wolf, there was no fear, no terror. Man had no rival. In those days, the lands of Subur and Hamazi, harmony-tongued Sumer, the great land of the decrees of princeship, Uri, the land having all that is appropriate, the land of Martu, resting in security, the whole universe, the people in unison, to Enlil, in one tongue spoke. Then Enki, the Lord of abundance and the true word, the Lord of wisdom, who watches over the land, the leader of the gods, endowed with wisdom, the Lord of Eridu, changed the speech in their mouths, brought contention into it, into the speech of man, that until then had been one. Well, that's the Tower of Babel story in an ancient Babylonian myth. And it turns out Ea was causing trouble by sowing dissension. Now, unfortunately, that text only exists in a fragment. Archaeologists have not found the end of the story. We don't know why Ea did that, or, what happens. Is it an example of divine Sophia-phobia? Were the gods afraid that mankind might become too intelligent, too wise, and therefore wanted to keep us down by making sure we remain ignorant, by splitting up our knowledge into different disciplines, subjects, different languages? Interestingly, I've got some news for you, because the Druids have a take on this story as well. We have an ancient legend that the founder of the Druids, Phineas Farsaith, was passing by as they were building the Tower of Babel, and he saw it going up, and he said, that's going to cause trouble. They're trying to build up to God in the sky, but anyone with any sense knows that God is everywhere. You don't need that. God is in the heart, in the intelligence. So he founded, this is the Druid story, he founded a language school which became Druidry, to keep the knowledge of the original language of mankind, so it be passed down, so that when people began thinking, well, I speak Hebrew and I hate you, you speak Arabic. Oh, I hate you, I speak Latin, you speak Gaelic, I'm going to conquer you. I hate you because you speak English, or whatever, all this intercultural linguistic hatred. What the Druids did was they knew the knowledge of the unity behind all languages. And that was passed down, right down to the Druid tribes of, Ireland, Wales, Gaul, etc. And I love that story. That story is in Geoffrey Keating, the 17th century historian of Druids and Irish history, who was himself a priest who was killed by a fanatical Cromwellian Protestant trooper in a church, which is a shocking disgrace. I'm never against killing priests, like what happened to the Jesuit in India. So Ea, I don't know. I suspend judgment on what he was doing there. I personally don't believe that the gods are that mean to have deliberately made humanity so ignorant and stupid. I believe that the gods are fundamentally good and want us to find wisdom. And that's what I mean about ethical wisdom and enlightenment. I think it's our fear of the gods is holding us back. we think there might be devils. We're afraid of these gods, and so we have to kill them and kill people that follow them. Whereas if we could accept each one's narrative, each one's story as being sacred, and see the wisdom in it, yeah, like Benjamin Franklin, as a Freemason, discovered electricity by playing around with kites. And the electricity we rely on for everything came from that discovery. It comes in a positive and negative energy current. It's made of electrons. And that's amazing. And so everything comes from that one ultimate energy, I would say. We needn't fight over what we call it. Anyway, so that's that's Ea, and of course his story is complex, and I've only touched the surface here. If people want more, you have to go to the book and study the text. He's quite a god, I tell you. We find temples and shrines erected in his honour at Nippur, Girsu, Babylon, Sippar, and Nineveh. His consort was called Ninhursag, and she had other names. And they found examples of Ea's worship in Ebla, which is a city in Syria, discovered by archaeologists, where they found a huge number of tablets. They worship Ea there as well. And you know, it's fascinating. I love all this ancient Semitic God language stuff. If you go into the archaeological route of biblical studies, it's absolutely fascinating, and some people specialise in it. So I think an important deity, and we need to get him to help rebuild the jetty off Gaza, get a ceasefire and a mediation between the extremists on both sides, and bring in supplies for these poor people in Gaza who are suffering. That surely is the wisdom path to solve this conflict. I think we need to apply wisdom, whether it's of Ea or Tengri, to solve these conflicts on the planet. I think we have to go on the assumption that the gods want us to solve these problems. To think otherwise, I think, is rather silly. That's why I support UNESCO's work in advancing education around the planet. Yes, bless you. Okay, any final comments? J'ai fini pour maintenant, ça suffit? Oui? C'est une grande histoire, tout ça.
Oui.
Il y a beaucoup de choses pour réfléchir. Et, anyway, let's hope that by next week we have some peace holding in the Gaza situation and supplies getting in better. And hostages being released, that has to be part of the ceasefire agreements and things. Okay, let's have more wisdom, that's what I said. Let's have more Tengri and more Ea. Okay. Right, we'll finish there. Thank you.